Steve Beauchamp back with you again today. And today, we're going to talk a little bit about how our emotions can play tricks with our minds. If you're anything like me, and I'm nothing special, so you probably can relate. I cannot tell you how many times in my life that I have felt, like my emotions were taking control of my mind, right? So that I tended to act or say things in a certain way that weren't really consistent with how I wanted to behave, and I know logically, that things shouldn't, be done a certain way, or that things aren't the way they seem, but I still have my moments where emotions will flood in and take control. I mean, this still happens to me even today, even though I'm aware of it. And it's a regular, effort for me to, be conscious of this. And, often these moments will happen without any notice, right? They just, for whatever reason, your emotions will get triggered from a memory or from just from like an instance that seems similar, right, to what's going on. Or like I was saying before, it could be something that your brain is fabricating, right? And what I've found over the years is that emotions are very powerful things. And if we let them take control, they will take control of our minds, right? Like we have to consciously test to see if the emotions that we're feeling are in fact the ones that we want to allow into like our conscious, right? Because a lot of things happen subconsciously, but we have to be cognizant if we're going to allow them to become conscious things, right? So, and you've likely felt the effects of your brain jumping to a conclusion. I know I have. And this tends to happen when you don't have all the information, right? Or you could start filling in a narrative of a story that you only have little pieces to. And when that happens, this can be very damaging to not only yourself and your reputation, it can also be very damaging to the relationships that you have in your life. And, I think this flows into principle number 3 fairly well, where Musashi, wrote that do not in any circumstance depend on a partial feeling. And, what I've understood so far from like trying to unpack a little bit more about what Musashi was trying to say here is that, we should never appear cold or distant from our emotions, right? That's not what he's saying. But what he's saying rather is that we should have an attitude toward all things and all people that is neither dependent nor partial nor, egotistic. And so, well, what does that mean? Well, you shouldn't come off as not having any emotion at all, but rather you should test your emotions to make sure that they're not just partial things, that you're not fabricating something that isn't there. And, I think I have a real life example of, of where my brain started, letting the emotion take control. I started filling in the gaps. And so let me tell you about it. So a few weeks ago, I was in Phoenix, Arizona for a conference. And when I was down there, back home here, one of my dogs was pretty sick. And side note, it was a really tough decision for me to make to actually go on the trip in the first place. But when I went, he was stable, and I had this peace about the decision while I was still here that it was the right decision to continue with my plans to go. And so we had a dog sitter that came and, you know, stayed with my dogs. And, you know, we got a message from them stating that they had to step out to attend something that came up and wasn't able to be at home with the dogs as planned on the first day that we were gone. Okay. So here I am, you know, sitting in the hotel room, and I'm just like, what the hell, right? Like, this is the day one, and things are just kind of like all over the place. And I'm just kind of freaking out on the inside. My emotions are all over the place. And I start creating this story that, you know, I made a mistake. I shouldn't have gone, and I shouldn't, you know, have had a dog sitter staying with them because, you know, they're not going to give them the kind of care that I would have given them and that I want them to get. And they're just, you know, not going to care for them the way that I will. And finally, after what seemed like an eternity, but which was only like an hour or two, you know, the dog sitter called us. And, you know, in that moment, she was able to give us some reassurance that we did pick the right person to watch our dogs. And, well, you know, what I found, and I'm not going to get into the details, but what I found was there was some information that was being left out of text messaging that allowed me to start creating a false narrative. Like, which is why, you know, texting can be really challenging, and you tend to miss some of the like the context. And, you know, maybe you've had moments like this, right, where you let your mind kind of run wild with partial information and partial thoughts. I'm sure you have. I mean, we've all done it. And in fact, it would appear that 400 years ago, they had the same problem, right? Because Musashi wrote this over 400 years ago, telling them, don't rely on partial feelings, because it can put you into a situation where you may act or say in a manner that's not consistent with who you want to be. So question becomes then, what do we do? And how can we move through the world without depending on these partial feelings? Well, you know, I think, first of all, it's important, I think, for us to feel, right? I'm not suggesting that emotions are bad. And I think we could all do better to get more in tune with our emotion and be more comfortable sharing what our emotions are with others. However, we shouldn't be depending on like partial emotion and partial feeling, right? Because if we allow some of our altered states of consciousness to really dictate how we're going to move through life, we need to be really careful, right? Because we all depend on altered states of consciousness, right, to help us process life experience. I mean, this is nothing new. Our brains are working faster than we can talk, right? But I think it's important to recognize that our altered state can often be incomplete and misleading. And so what I've discovered is, by discovering who my authentic self is and regularly reflecting on who I am, right? So like really getting to the core of who is Steve, and, you know, what do I stand for, and why do I stand for it, and what does standing for it mean, and how do I communicate what I stand for to the people around me? And going, you know, a step back from that, who is my like authentic self? Like, who am I really at my core? Because when I understand who I am at my core, I'm much less likely to embrace feelings that don't line up with that authenticity, right? And I'm much more able to depend on like where my ikigai really resides, right? So I can really find joy in any moment in life if I'm constantly referring back to and self-reflecting on who my authentic self is. And, when we learn who we are, we can then learn to depend on feelings that we get from our ikigai, because then we know that that flows from our authentic selves, right? The Japanese referred to that as ikigai kan. And we can allow those feelings to help guide us to make better decisions. And, this kind of comes full circle back to principle number 1, where talked about, acceptance of our true authentic selves. And principle number 2, which, if you just watched it, really talks about us not chasing pleasure. So, perhaps when we can accept our true selves and not seek pleasure, maybe it becomes much easier for us not to create these false narratives. And, I think I can't tell you definitively just yet whether or not that's true, although I can tell you that there are moments where that's true, right? Where I know that through discovering my ikigai and through understanding the feelings that come from those things that my ikigai is all about, that this is a much easier thing for me. I have much less instances of me trying to create these stories where there really isn't a story to create. And so I'm going to leave you with that for today. And, if this is resonating for you, I'd really appreciate it if you'd like or comment or subscribe to my channel. And, give me some feedback. I always, love to hear whether this is resonating with you. And I hope you have a wonderful day, and